About my mother. Now, my parents had a very typical beginning love story. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, my dad changed all his plans. He had just gotten a certificate to be a forest ranger, if you can imagine that, and for way back then. And he joined the Army. My mother, and then they got married on a weekend leave. My mother got tired of waiting for him, so she joined the Army. And this is all my parents ever talked about, was being in the Army. And my mother hadn't had any children by then. She left behind her scrapbook. It was this thick. She saved every single Army-based newsletter. And I thought, wow, I think I'll write about my mother in the Army during World War II. I got to the end of the scrapbook and I realized all she did was type for the colonel, which is necessary but boring. Well, lo and behold, a tiny little article in her South Carolina Army-based newsletter, December 11th, 1943, it said, "Whacks find wasps in barracks." And they used a lot of anachronisms back then, and I started studying and exploring who were these women pilots. I asked people from the World War II generation, have you heard about the women pilots? I asked my peers. Very few people heard about the women pilots, and thus began my 3-year journey into reading as much as I could and meeting many of the women pilots themselves. Jacqueline Cochran was the director of the Women Air Force Service Pilots. She was voted the best female pilot in 1938. She set new transcontinental speed records, and she was the first woman to break the sound barrier, along with Chuck Yeager. She convinced the President, the General, and Mrs. Roosevelt to establish the Women Air Force Service Pilots in 1942. How did women find out about the Women Air Force Service Pilots? This interested me very much. Well, many of the women saw the cover of Life magazine. The other curious fact I began to wonder about was that in order to join the service pilots, a woman had to have a pilot's license already. And I thought, how did 25,000 women have their pilot's licenses back then? In further research, I discovered that the president in 1939 was worried about the impending war, and he declared there to be established in every state in the United States a civil pilot training class at one college at least in every state. And they did allow girls, which is what they were called back then. 25,000 applied who already had their pilot's licenses. 1,830 entered and 1,074 graduated. There were a few black women pilots that were qualified, and Jackie Cochran said to one in particular that I got to read about, Janet Harmon Bragg. She said to her, "Janet, you're very qualified to join the WASPs, but I'll tell you right now, our women have to crisscross across the country and deliver planes to our men at 134 Army bases, and we have to stay in hotels in order to accomplish this. And because of the segregation laws, I think you will have too many problems." So there were no black pilots whatsoever in the Women Air Force Service Pilots. there were 2 Chinese. Segregation ended in 1948. Thought I'd mention that fact. So, began the training. The women went to Sweetwater Springs, Texas, Aviation Enterprises. Director Cochran's stunning auburn hair cascaded down over one eye like Veronica Lake's. I couldn't keep my eyes off of her. She was by far the most attractive lady I had ever seen in my life. I snapped to attention when she said, "Ladies, here's your schedule. 0600 hours is Reveille. 0700 hours begins ground school. You will have the following classes: physics, meteorology, maps, navigation, math, Morse code, military law, study of firearms, flight theory, instruments, and mechanics. At 1330 hours, report to the flight line where you'll begin to practice on our primary trainers or PT-19s. Back at the barracks, we had a grand old time trying on our so-called uniforms. "Which size do you want, shrimp? Large or large?" teased Lana as we tried on the surplus Army Air Force GI mechanic coveralls. "Why, Violet, honey child, you're all swimming in 'em." May laughed because she was almost as tall as Lana. "You look a little better than I do," I said to May and Lana. "The size 44 men's large. May put the crotch down to your thighs, but on me it goes to my knees. Look, the breast pocket is on my hip." I laughed so hard it led to a coughing fit. The olive drab tent cloth faded flight coveralls were almost 2 sizes too big for each of us. "Yippee! Here are the belts. Maybe they'll help." And in meeting many of the WASPs, that was a common thing for them to say over and over. "Thank God there were belts." Adele flapped them around, hysterically laughing. Petite May Lee, always ready for a joke, got into my coveralls, and we both paraded around as we bent over and wriggled our bottoms. And this was so much fun for me to be able to put this photograph in my book, because to describe this is hard to believe. Lana, May, and Adele cinched up the huge baggy Harlem-like zoot suits, twirling and modeling while all the gals busted up laughing. Well, the women Air Force service pilots were paid by civil service. They were part of the Army, but they weren't in the Army. Therefore, they got surplus uniforms. You'll hear more about that story. When the women would solo and pass their first solo flight in over 77 types of aircraft, they would be thrown into this really beautiful wishing well in Sweetwater, Texas, and retrieve a shiny penny for good luck. That was common practice. Well, like I said, the women ferry pilots ferried planes from the factories to the Army bases for the men to fly into combat. Well, they also did another job, and this job was called tow targeting. This is a letter written from one friend at one Army base to another friend, and cell phones weren't around, emails weren't around, phones didn't really, you couldn't speak to somebody on the phone from one Army base to another. Correspondence was everything. I have a lot of letter writing in my book. "Dear Violet, Towing target sleeves for the gunnery crews has proved to be quite thrilling, and it really stretches my skill as a pilot. Every day I fly an A-24 with a 30-foot long muslin sleeve at the end of 1,500 feet of steel cable. Army officers on the ground shoot off round after round of gunfire at the long piece of cloth that tails behind me. This is the best way for soldiers to practice their firing. I really enjoy working with these two privates, Arnie and Lee. They are gas. Arnie shoots yellow wax bullets and Lee shoots blue. After they signal me down, they count the colored holes in the sleeve and pony up bets to see who shot the most. They are very complimentary about my flying, and I love doing it. Arnie especially is a hot looker with short brown wavy hair and thick eyebrows and the dreamiest blue eyes. It's his smile that really gets to me. The other day I was beginning to feel very confident in my flying ability, keeping my eyes straight ahead, knowing one wrong turn and I could be shot at.